And I'm share my screen.
Thank you.
And just, jump in at any point, Come on, where is there we go. Is that it? Oh, there. It was stretched out on the next screen. Yeah. Because my other screen is bigger than the laptop screen. Okay, so we're going to talk about a student book project that I've done actually the last 3 years. The background of this is that I attended, well, actually, the reasons why I've done this more broadly is when students are actually creating this project together, and I know that's something you do all the time, have students do work on project, they're engaged in active learning, which tends to result in deeper learning, more long-term learning. It helps them deepen and create more connections to other things. They tend to get really excited about it when they're creating something that they're going to have after the term. And one of the things they've mentioned is, this is something I can show my parents. This is something I can show my friends about what I learned in this class, because this class in particular is a capstone course. So it pulls together a lot of things. It results generally in a lot more engagement. And it's also what David Wiley, who runs Lumen Learning, calls a non-disposable assignment, that students often, when they do writing projects or turn in exams or do anything in course management systems, they go in, they get submitted in the course management system, and then they never see them again. That once the semester ends, they even lose access to them unless they keep them on their own separately, which many students will do. But for the most part, once the semester's over, their work just sort of disappears. And here they're creating something that lives on after the class itself. And that's something that tends to create a little more sense of value. And it's also quite a bit more fun because the students are picking the topics in this particular project. And, they're picking topics that they're interested in, that they want to learn more about. And that tends to increase, again, motivation quite a bit. And also pretty much eliminates or dramatically reduces issues of academic dishonesty, because they're working on something that they've chosen uniquely, and they're working with other students, which makes it really hard for them to engage in dishonesty, although plagiarism issues do sometimes crop up. But I've only had a significant case of that once in the last 3 years, which is much less than I've had in other classes where there was more traditional types of assessments for economics classes. So I first listened to Robin DeRosa on some podcasts. She presented at CIT in 2018. And then I invited her to be on our podcast, and she visited here, gave a presentation and a workshop. And she pretty much sold me on the benefits of open pedagogy projects. So the next semester, I gave students in the capstone class, where they had always written term papers where they picked the topic, but they were generally individual papers and so forth. I gave them the option of either doing individual projects, individual term papers, sort of like a capstone paper or senior project in some way, or trying an open pedagogy alternative. And I referred to them to the podcast we had recorded, and they really liked the idea. So we tried it. And what I've done each year is I've given them some suggestions of possible topics, which they've rejected every time. So they come up with their own, but that's great because they actually did come up with ideas they wanted to explore, and that gives a lot more motivation. And they generally, 2 of the 3 years, they picked topics that I was really impressed by. Last year, it didn't work quite as well, but we'll get to that in just a second. In 2019, the topic they wanted to work on was the issue of why we have so much income inequality, why it's been growing, and why we see declines in intergenerational income mobility, why it's becoming increasingly hard for people to move out of the bottom of the income distribution to the next generation moving up in that income distribution, and why we tend to have so much lock-in on this. So basically, they were addressing issues of why incomes have become so much more unequal and why that's growing over time and why that problem's becoming worse. And they did some pretty good work with that. In 2020, they chose something fairly similar, but they were looking more generally at why there's wage differentials. And they came up with a variety of areas where they looked at discrimination, they looked at the returns to education, they looked at the quality of school systems, they looked at, the impact of having local finance for public schools and so forth. And they looked at geographical differences and a whole host of other factors explaining why wages differ. And last year, they couldn't really come to a consensus. About half the class wanted to do something related to the economic impact of the pandemic, and the other half of the class pretty much wanted to do anything other than discuss the pandemic, because their reaction was, we're dealing with this every day, let's do something different. And they could not come to a consensus either for or against it. So basically, they picked a broad theme where they came up with a list of topics and they assigned themselves to groups on the topics. And they just did a series of essays that were not terribly well related. But so it was essentially a series of group projects that came out in this format of a book. So I did like the themes they chose the other years, but that was the best they could do. And again, this is what they chose to do. And that was generally the first day's meeting. Like, okay, do you want to do just term papers, or do you want to do something as a group project? And I gave them other options. I said, we could do any number of formats. But once I told them the second year that they did a book the year before, they wanted to do the same thing. I said, one option you could have is you could take what they did and build on it. And that's something that many people advocating open pedagogy have suggested. Robin DeRosa did that first with an anthology of, I think it was early American literature. And then she suggested that, the next year the class could build on it. And every year they wanted to do their own thing. They didn't want to take someone else's work and polish it, refine it, and add to it. They wanted to do something that was unique to them. And that's pretty much been my experience too. They wanted to do something pretty much completely different, or at least to some extent different than what the other groups did. And so as a whole class discussion, once they came up with a broad topic where essentially we used a Jamboard where they threw ideas up there, and then we tried to group them together into some sort of theme. Here, they just chose different topics last year. Before that, they picked the broad topic and what are some of the things we could talk about, for example, about income inequality or intergenerational mobility? What are some of the factors the next time dealing with wage differentials? Why do we see different wages across people, across jobs, across region, across races, gender, and so forth? And so they came up with these broad categories, and then we came up with enough so that they could be arranged into groups. Then they were split into groups that generally had similar interests, although that's varied a little bit. But actually, I take that back. What I did to split them into groups each time was, I think it was each time, was to ask them, because much of the research they're going to be studying uses statistical analysis and mathematical analysis and so forth, and econometric analysis. I asked them how many math courses they had. And then I sorted them. I used a simple Google form. I sorted them from highest to lowest and then grouped them by that, or so that each group had at least one person who had quite a few math courses, and then had at least someone who didn't have as many. So there was one person who's got a lot of experience, one with a moderate, and one with less experience with that. So each group was, at least to some extent, somewhat balanced with that. And that's worked pretty well. Now, they generally wanted to sort by their friends, but what I suggested to them when they said, well, we'd like to form groups, and I said, well, why, or how do you know each other in the groups? They said, well, we took a lot of courses together and we've worked together before. And I said, well, how equitable would it be if all the people who took the most classes together in economics or in math were all grouped together, while the people who hadn't had as much experience in this, we're working with other people or taking as many courses, were the ones left out to form the other groups. And generally that convinced them that, yeah, this would be a little bit more fair. And that's worked pretty well so far.
Very smart.
Well, I learned that from someone else in a workshop somewhere along the way, and it's worked pretty well. And And then what I had them do is they met in the groups to talk about the topics. So when we were remote 2 years ago, well, last year, I guess it was the spring of 2020, and it was in person in 2019, because this was before the pandemic. It was right in January. They met in the groups and they talked about what topics they'd most like to work on from the list of topics, because we narrowed that down first. And then they were given 10 points that they could allocate in terms of how many points they wanted to vote for specific topics. If they really wanted to, they could put all 10 points on a topic if they all really deeply wanted that, or they could allocate it, 5 and 5 or 3, 3 and 4. And so the idea there was that there was some capture of intensity of preference. And then basically I looked at the first topic, sort through their submissions, either on paper or on in a Google form. And there was always one group that had the most votes for it, or if it was tied, they always had another option to fall back on. And that's worked out so far 3 times in coming up with the topics. And most of the time, like 60, 70% of the time, the group that most strongly wanted a topic got that topic, but everyone ended up with one of their top 2 choices. So they were generally pretty pleased with how that sorting worked out. And a lot of it was that their discussion within the group tended to solidify the choices. So they did narrow it down to a small number of topics. And then the project was scaffolded quite a bit. The next stage, typically actually in a second week or so, was they'd start working with an overall outline. So we did the first as a whole group, outlining the whole project in a very general way. And then for the next class, the group submitted a more detailed outline of their component. So they wrote up this, and it was all done with Google Documents. So they all had edit access to a folder for the group. And basically they inserted their own outline into that component of the whole book project, basically. And then the next class meeting, we talked about it a bit. And within their groups, they came up with a bibliography or preliminary bibliography of what they were going to look at. So actually the outline first, then a bibliography, and then the next week they submitted an annotated bibliography to provide a little bit more detail. And then they came up with, this was like in the 6th, 7th week or so, probably about the 7th week, a rough draft of a very rough outline of their document. And then what I did is I had them share it with each other using Hypothesis. So they all had Google Documents. There was a folder for each group within the broad group so they could see what other groups were doing. But then I took those and uploaded them into other folders as PDFs, and they use Hypothesis to annotate or to provide feedback on each other's. So each person in each group had to provide feedback on 3 of the other chapters. And they had a certain number of comments they had to provide, and that worked pretty well. So basically there was some peer review going on, all done using, well, I had Hypothesis in Blackboard. So they were adding comments right on the documents itself. At first, I let them do it with Google Chat. But one of the things that was happening is people were leaving feedback, and then the group would get notified that someone had left a comment, and they'd go back in and they'd make some changes, which made it really hard for me to track how much feedback each person was leaving, because it would disappear, and also, the progress in responding. So instead, very quickly, I switched to PDFs version, so it locked in the first draft, and then there was a record of the feedback, and then they used that feedback to come up with a second draft, and then it went through another stage of peer review, and at this stage each group addressed a different 3 chapters. So each group ended up providing feedback on 6 of the other groups in those first 2 stages. And so they got a variety of feedback from different groups of people. And then finally, the final draft, which also went through a similar review process. It was a little bit tight there, but it worked reasonably well. And they really enjoyed working with Hypothesis.
I want to interject just with a quick question.
Sure.
This is a wonderfully articulated and elaborated. I think my question is, are the students engaged in a whole lot of sort of primary reading, course reading outside of this project as well?
Yes, and that's something I scaled back a bit in the second and third iteration, because this was something, the first time I tried it, it was sort of like the term paper project, which just developed entirely separately from the other readings. The other thing that was done in this class is they came up with a list of topics, and then each week those topics were sometimes related, sometimes not related, where they voted on the topics. It was one per week. Originally, there were, I think, 13 of those, where each week there'd be one. They'd work in the same groups, but the groups would also present research papers or working papers on the topic to the class. And that got to be a bit too much, because it felt to them like it was taking almost two separate courses. So they were doing weekly presentations on a topic, which often related, but sometimes only tangentially. What I did the next term is I cut it down to about 8 such topics, and I had more of the topics overlap with their project. Right. And then last year, I think it was cut down to 6 or 7 weeks where they were presenting, and nearly all the topics were related to what they were doing in individual chapters. So it was also giving them some more feedback and so forth. I selected the papers, but they selected the topic. So each week there'd be most weeks, or about half or more of the weeks, there'd be some presentation on topics related to their book, their book project. So this was not the entire class, but it became progressively more and more of their time. And we spent more time working on it as a group and going through the individual chapters, and they gave final presentations of it. But yeah, there were other topics that were discussed too, but all the presentations were done by the students, and then they also were asking questions and so forth on that.
Okay, thank you.
That's probably not the most clear, but
no, that was clear. I'm just taking notes.
Okay. And I think I already described this. And then once it was all done, once they got to that final draft, I actually ported it over to a Pressbook. And Pressbook is a free site where basically you created a digital book. And what has happened each year is I gave them the option, if they would clean everything, if they would clean everything up and design a title page, I would actually convert it into a Kindle version. And the first 2 years, we never got that final version. We never got the title page, someone to put it together, because that was right at the very end. And last year, it came really close. We got a design for a title page, but it didn't quite work because they were designing not just the background for it, but they put in some text. And the other thing, though, was a lot of the images that they used, the graphs, were not in an accessible format. And I kept asking them to turn them in. They had them embedded in their documents, but I wasn't able to extract them to move them over. So it's still hanging out there. The whole document is there, but there's some missing graphs. So I never did convert it over to a Kindle version. But they have it. So all their work is out there on the web. And actually, that's the next thing. Here, so Pressbooks is just a site. It's pressbooks.com. But here's the first year's book. Actually, I can put this in the chat.
Yes, please.
The chapters vary a bit in quality, but overall, I was pretty impressed, especially given how much else they were doing. Yeah. So this is the first one, and this is the second one, and
nice.
And this is the most recent one.
This is very impressive.
I've been impressed with them, and they've generally enjoyed it. I think the first two are just a little bit better, and partly because the third one just didn't hang together as well as the others did. But some of them were superb, and they really took it very seriously and did some really great presentations on it too.
Did you? Is there like a table of contents inside of this? Can you
There
flip
is,
through
and
just
what
for a
you do
moment?
is if you click on Read Book, let me take one of the other. If you click on Read Book, you'll see the table is right up here. This one only had a main body. I think the first one, they grouped it into 3 sections, if I remember. So there were 3 sections. Yeah. The first one was on trends in income inequality and intergenerational mobility. And then the second part was on what are the causes of this. And the third was on consequences and remediation. And if you click on any of those, it will expand it. So these were the individual chapters.
So how much, like, I'm curious, how much would you say work was involved in porting it over into this format? And like, is you just drop it in and it turns into
a lot of it was copying and pasting. The main issue, and I'm so far behind on the third one. The first 2, the styles are all there. So they've got the heading structure in. The heading structures got lost when it was copied and pasted from Google Drive to here. So even though Google Drive has headers, they were lost here, and I had to put in the WordPress tags for it. So if we just click on, let's say if we go to political polarization. So I had to tag the title, enter in the name. So that was just copy and paste. I had to flag this as a section header. And then there's a subhead, a B-level head. So mostly it was just doing things like that, just going through wherever there was a title, changing it so that it was a header level 1, header level 2, and so forth.
This is so impressive. Wow.
So this is a chapter that was put together by 3 of the students.
Now, I'm out of curiosity, since I went to the SOAR session this morning. Have you sort of uploaded these to SOAR so that they can be searched?
I haven't, but partly it's because it's out there. They have them. They have a link to it. And one of the things they really liked is they could put this on their LinkedIn profile. They could put this on their resume and share it with people.
That's amazing.
And a basic book is free. But if you go to print the free book, it will come out. If you save it as a PDF, it will have a what is that called? Those letters that show up in the background.
Like a watermark.
A watermark, yeah. So if you use the free one and you try to save it as a PDF, you can read it online. It looks just like this. Right. But if you try to print it as a PDF, it will have the watermark. But if you pay I think it's like $89 or $90, it will remove that. And I've done that each year for them, just because if they want to have it, they could print up their section and so forth. And because it's all, on the web, they can link just to their chapter, because even though it's all shows up as a book here, they could link to the chapter directly and say, this is what I created. And, they've been pretty impressed by that.
I'm going to say I'm impressed. I mean, just to a casual glance at this, it's extremely clean copy. I can't get English majors to produce such clean copy.
One of the things that has helped there is that peer review process, going through 3 stages of that, where they're giving feedback to each other. And some of it was just on grammar and copy editing and so forth, but a lot of it, the most common thing is a lot of them were just correcting grammar early on. I said, well, that's good, but it would be really good if you gave people more feedback on the clarity of their writing and so on.
Right. Right.
So.
I know that our time is short. I just want to ask one, God, I've already half forgotten the question. I have a million questions. I love this. Last semester in my English writing portfolio class, I had my students try to create what I call an unruly writing guide. And they just really struggled with it. And I can see part of why from what you've done. But I think the idea that they would they just, did a Google slide to be able to turn it into a book is extremely meaningful. And I really, really want to try to see if I can adapt this.
All you need to do is go to Pressbooks.com and create a free account. You log in. I've got to log in, and I've got a number of things on here. See, under here is my books. Here's my econometrics book, which I'm porting from another format. Here was one I used for an open pedagogy workshop, to get people to work with. But basically, you just you create a book by clicking on create a new book.
Wow.
And the interface is just like WordPress. So it's, you put in more information about the authors and so forth. Like apparently I'm the editor on this. I don't claim it as my own publication, but there's in theory, you could have the students do it, but I think that probably would just be complicated, and it would be hard to get them to do it cleanly.
You're the sole interfacer with this.
With this version of it.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Oh my gosh, this is brilliant.
And
I love it.
So yeah, it's worked really well.
It sounds like actually, let me ask you this question off, at another time. I would really love to see the syllabus to see how it's constructed in that form.
And I have that somewhere. Let me see if I can.
No hurry on it.
Well, let me just see. Well, that's actually what they did the first night too. That they actually created the syllabus.
Yeah.
Let me see. I should have that. It will be under. It's on. I've got it open on my other window, but let me see if I can. It should be under class. Yeah, class Dropbox folders I have, and then let me take one from. Well, here's one from spring 2020. And let me download that. And I will drop it into the chat.
Thank you so much.
I can find that back. Where did I go? Where did it go? Okay, let me stop the screen share and then I can okay, if I can find the chat. The screen again.
Oh, this happens to me.
It dragged across the other one. And here it goes.
Oh, beautiful. If I click save chat, will that just sweep everything up for me?
It should, but maybe not the document. I think the document you'd have to download. It's just
okay,
a Word doc.
I see. Right. I'll do that right now while I have it open. While it's open here.
Yeah. So, and I'm just looking at it. So they had the option of doing a podcast paper, but they chose to do the project. And the group book chapter was 30% of the grade, but the peer feedback was 15%. Yeah, so a lot of it was based on the project, and more of it shifted to that.
And it sounds like, I mean, are you making qualitative assessments of these chapters as they get turned in at the end?
Yeah, I'm giving them feedback too.
Right, but in terms of like, did you find yourself giving the people who work together on a chapter essentially the same grade based on that chapter?
No, I had them do, I should mention that too. I had them do some peer and self evaluations of that, plus I was able, because what I did is to tell the individual contributions, I had them each write in a different color in the Google Doc. So, and I had them at the top of each document post a chart with the names in the color that they use within the document. So someone would be blue, someone would be green, someone would be purple or something similar. And so I could pretty quickly scan through and give them, and I gave them feedback on each stage of the project based on my own assessment of their contributions. And, some of them had to be nudged a little bit to contribute, because there's always some issues there.
Hard to read in those different colors?
Well, I told them to choose dark colors with high contrast. It was sometimes hard to tell the dark blue from, a purple, so I'd tell them to change it a little bit if it was too close. But the other thing you could always do is look at the edit history and see the contributions of any one person, because that will highlight each person too. Since it was all done in Google Docs.
Right.
Oh, and actually, we should stop this one because there's another one. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop this one and come back for the next session.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.